waiting for.
Olá a todos, é uma alegria estarmos aqui com vocês para darmos início ao quarto Congresso da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia da Educação. Este evento é realizado na Universidade de São Paulo, na Faculdade de Educação da Universidade de São Paulo, ainda que por meios virtuais, e conta com o apoio, então, da direção da nossa unidade, e também com o apoio de dois grupos de pesquisas sediados também na Faculdade de Educação da USP, o grupo da professora Cristiane Gottschalk, Filosofia, Educação, Linguagem e Pragmática, e com o grupo de estudos clássicos da Faculdade de Educação da Universidade de São Paulo, o PAIDEU. Nós agradecemos muito a presença de todos que estão aqui acompanhando a nossa programação e a palestra do professor Gert Biesta daqui a alguns instantes, seja no Meet, seja no YouTube. Eu passo, então, a palavra agora ao professor Bruno Drummond, que integra o grupo de estudos clássicos da USP, que fará a apresentação do professor Samuel Mendonça, que é o presidente da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia da Educação, e depois a apresentação e também ele vai ciceronear o professor Gert Biesta. Então, que tenhamos todos um bom evento. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Marcos. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Um bom dia. Iniciamos agora, então, os trabalhos do quarto Congresso da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia da Educação. Eu vou, sem delongas, passar a palavra ao professor Samuel Mendonça, presidente da Sociedade e professor permanente do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Educação da Pontifícia Universidade Católica, PUC, de Campinas. Por favor, professor Samuel, fique à vontade, a palavra é sua.
Muito obrigado, Bruno, pela exposição inicial, pela apresentação, e eu quero fazer aqui uma brevíssima introdução no sentido do espírito do nosso quarto congresso, dizendo, primeiro, obrigado a vocês que aqui estão, porque a razão da nossa sociedade exatamente reside naqueles que fazem da sociedade a sua vida, que são os nossos professores, os programas de pós-graduação que estão espalhados nos diversos programas do Brasil, nas faculdades de educação e também de filosofia, enfim, a comunidade acadêmica. Muitíssimo obrigado. Esse quarto congresso foi pensado para ter sido realizado em 2020, mas é evidente que nós, no contexto da pandemia, tivemos o cuidado de pensar um momento mais adequado, que este momento está sendo agora, mesmo que, como disse o professor Marcos, que eu aproveito para deixar um agradecimento muito especial a toda a comissão organizadora, em nome diretamente do professor Marcos Pagotto, da FEUSP, e nós, então, conseguimos realizar, neste momento, com toda a infraestrutura, com as transmissões, com um número gigante de pessoas que estão envolvidas para que a qualidade das nossas conferências, a qualidade das comunicações, de toda a programação, e tudo isso disponível no nosso site, que todo mundo possa apreciar, pensar sobre esse tema geral da conferência, do congresso, que é Política e Filosofia na Escola, a urgência do pensamento. Talvez nós não tivéssemos um tema mais apropriado para o Brasil de 2022. Quero também registrar o agradecimento à professora Carlota Boto, que justamente está na gestão da instituição, na FEUSP, e a todos os colegas de outras instituições, da própria diretoria da SOFI. Nós temos uma gestão que tem feito um trabalho importante, e registrar também que teremos às 14 horas a nossa assembleia, e é importante que todos os filiados participem da assembleia, é um momento importante para uma reflexão sobre uma avaliação do trabalho feito e, claro, a prospecção dos próximos anos da nossa sociedade. É uma honra receber o professor Gert Biesta aqui nesse nosso evento. Eu o conheci em 2009 por ocasião de um congresso da Philosophy of Education Society nos Estados Unidos, em São Francisco, e de lá para cá passei a tomar contato com seus textos, seus livros, e nós estamos já, de fato, diante de uma referência importante da educação. E para a nossa conferência, para o espírito da sociedade brasileira, é muito importante que nós tenhamos esse tipo de interlocução com outros filósofos da educação de outros países, né? Então, é muito interessante que nós tenhamos a abertura do nosso congresso com o professor Gert Biesta, justamente porque ele tem um significado importante em relação a outras sociedades de filosofia da educação, tanto do Reino Unido como dos Estados Unidos e outros lugares. É claro que quem vai falar mais precisamente disso vai ser o Bruno, não vou adiantar nada sobre isso, mas quero deixar esse registro de agradecimento pelo trabalho e a sua presença tem um símbolo importante para todos nós. De forma bem breve, quero também registrar um agradecimento a todos os estudantes que estão diretamente, não só da comissão organizadora, mas de outras universidades também, professores que estão agora, nesse momento, em salas de aula e estão utilizando as suas aulas para prestigiar o nosso evento em diversas universidades do nosso país. E esta é uma possibilidade que a tecnologia acabou de nos presentear. Embora nós tenhamos uma avaliação evidente muito negativa da pandemia, alguma coisa nós aprendemos a fazer esse evento utilizando da própria tecnologia e estamos certamente atingindo um público muito significativo. De forma objetiva e final, um agradecimento nominal ao professor Luiz Roberto Gomes, que é o nosso secretário da Sociedade, o professor Vanderlei Carbonara, que é o nosso tesoureiro, as pessoas que estavam mais diretamente ali na gestão mesmo da Sociedade. Quero deixar registrado esse agradecimento ao trabalho feito ao longo desses tempos e devolvo a palavra ao Bruno para a condução dessa nossa conferência. Muito obrigado a todos e a todas.
Muito obrigado, professor Samuel. Passo, então, a apresentar, primeiro em português, o professor Gert Biesta, que, como disse o professor Samuel, já se tornou uma referência nos estudos de filosofia da educação. O professor Gert Biesta é professor de educação pública no Centro para Educação Pública e Pedagogia da Universidade de Maynooth, na Irlanda, e professor de Teoria Educacional e Pedagogia na Moray House, Escola de Educação e Esporte da Universidade de Edimburgo. Ele recentemente esteve como professor na Universidade de Agder, na Noruega, e nos departamentos de Educação, Artes e Ofícios e Saúde Mental, na Uniartes de Helsinki, na Finlândia, e no Centro de Pesquisas Educacionais e Desenvolvimento Acadêmico em Artes. O professor Biesta é autor de diversos livros e artigos muito relevantes no campo da educação, e o seu livro mais recente chama-se World-Centered Education, A View for the Present. Então, a educação centrada no mundo, uma visão para o presente, publicada pela Routledge no ano passado. Professor Biesta, please feel very, very welcomed. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us. And so I would say, if we were together, that the floor is yours, but virtually maybe the proper expression would be the time is yours. Please.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here, and also for all the flexibility behind the scenes to make this happen. I really appreciate that. So I'm pleased that we managed to find a time that worked. So it's good morning for you, and it's early afternoon here in Scotland. I have prepared a presentation with a PowerPoint, so I'll get the PowerPoint up in a minute. Probably I should do that now to explain the plan I have. Let me see if how I do that. I hope you can see this. The only thing is that I can no longer see any of you. So let's hope that this works. Can you see it? Can someone say?
Yeah,
Yes,
it's working
it's
fine.
clear.
Okay, good. So I was thinking what would be nice to do for a conference on philosophy of education. And I thought it would be interesting, hopefully for you and also for me, to share some recent work I've been doing, which in a sense is where I'm still developing my ideas. And yeah, I also hope that once I've shared some of my thinking with you, we'll have an opportunity for some conversation and discussion. So let's see where we end up. I also keep an eye on the clock. I always do a bit much, so that's a warning. But hopefully you'll get a sense of what I'll try to do. Basically, what I want to share are reflections on what broadly we can call intercultural education. Although one thing I'll do is to raise questions even about that whole notion of intercultural. And this has something to do indeed with questions of education, questions of culture, questions of the other, and I'll come back to that as well. And all this for me centers around pedagogy, but I also want to play with the whole question of time. So in the title, you already find an indication of some of the main themes. Now, when you look at the field of intercultural education, and at least in the parts of the world where I work, this is quite a big topic, not just amongst researchers and scholars and educational theorists and philosophers, but very much in education policy, and I'll share some insights in European education policy. What you find under the heading of intercultural education is the idea that as educators, we should prepare our students for them encountering others, cultural others, I'll explain all of that, in a world that is seen as increasingly diverse. So I take this roughly as the quick definition of intercultural education. And then some people say, well, this is a really good idea that we do that as educators. There are a lot of problems in this diverse world, and intercultural education can be a solution for this. But of course, as people who like philosophy and theory, we always need to ask, well, is it really such a good idea, or are there problems in this? And what I want to highlight are some problems, not just to identify the problems and stop there, but also to suggest a different way to engage educationally with this whole question of encounter and diversity. What I'll try to do is to highlight the importance of encounter and make that a little less ethical, and I hope that will become clear. I also want to raise questions about the idea that intercultural education has the task of empowering our students, and I'll put another notion in contrast there, the idea that education can be and should be, you could say, a matter of disarmament. And all of that, as I said, I try to keep together around the notion of pedagogy, which is a difficult notion because I come from continental Europe, and their pedagogy in German means something very different from what pedagogy means in England. And I already heard you using the word pedagogia, or if I pronounce it roughly okay. And I'm always also curious what that means in Portuguese. So there are translation issues here at stake as well. Now, one sort of structure in the talk and the argument is that I consider three different positions, and I want to name them also so that you are aware of that. One I call the third person position, and you can say we are in a third person position when we try to explain a phenomenon from the outside. We are an observer to the situation. And I'll show how that plays a role in intercultural education. As an educator, I'm always interested not in explanations, but you can say also in the first person position, the question what there is to do for each of us. You can say the question for me. But then I think that in addition to, you can say, the third person position where we look from the outside, the first person position, which is maybe the question for the student, but in a sense also for the teacher. I think the teacher stands again in a different position, and I want to suggest to call that the second person position, where the teacher stands in a relationship with the student, you could say, and with the world. So I think the position of the teacher is a very special one. The teacher is not there to explain. The teacher is not the same as the student, but stands sort of halfway. That position is also special because as teachers, we ultimately should disappear. The work of teachers stops at some point, and I think that's important and special about being a teacher as well. In the book that Bruno also mentioned, I have a nice quote from Bertolt Brecht, the German theater maker, where he says, every teacher must learn when to stop teaching when the time is there. And he says that's a really difficult art. And he says only a few teachers are able, when the time is there, to let reality take over their work. And there is a lot of wisdom in this sentence, and I will come back to that towards the end of the talk. What I'm doing in the paper is to push back against third-person perspectives. I think that the perspective of education is never to explain our students. I don't want that to be anti-intellectual, to say we should stop thinking and just doing. But I'm more interested in how third-person explanations relate to first-person issues and what I call second-person possibilities. So you could say the work of the teacher. Now, I don't know whether any of you like knitting, but when I was thinking about what am I trying to do in this presentation, I think I'm trying to knit together 5 different notions, 5 different explorations. I will say something about preparation, culture, the other time, and pedagogy. And I hope that some beautiful sock or sweater will come out of this, but let's see whether it hangs together. So that's the plan. And I'll do it in 5 steps, and I will announce each step with a big number. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of preparation. That is because intercultural education is seen as preparing our students for something. But I think more generally, a lot of thinking and talking about education sees education as preparation, a common educational trope, idea, education as the preparation for later. So you are all familiar with this, where we say, what's the task of education? It's to equip students with knowledge, skills, and dispositions for something, for work, for future life, for citizenship. You will find theories that say we prepare our students for eternal life, whatever that may be, or we prepare them for more education, or we prepare them for encounters with other human beings. Now, those of you who know John Dewey may know this phrase, where Dewey says very early on in his career, I believe that education is a process of living and not a preparation for future living. So Dewey is already critical of the idea of preparation, although I'm not entirely sure what he is saying there, because if he says education is a process of living, for me, that's not precise enough. I want to know what kind of process of living education is, because work is also a process of living. Family life is a process of living. Sports is a process of living. You can say almost anything is a process of living. But the problem I see with this idea that we should give our students knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and these three I see all over the world, and that we then say this is to empower our students. One thing I worry about, and it is in the idea of empowerment, is that we say actually we give our students tools, equipment, arms, you could say, to make them ready for something. And in empowerment, you can say, is this idea that we make our students stronger and more prepared so that they are ready for this encounter. Empowerment may sound good in some situations. It's never black and white for me, but I worry that if this is our thinking about education, and particularly if this is our thinking about intercultural education, you can say before we know it, we are telling our students that this other human being that they will encounter is sort of a potential threat. And therefore they need to be armed and prepared to encounter that threat. And there you can say, so I'm just playing a bit with the notion of empowerment, that I am first of all positioned as a student, as someone who should care about my own survival. So meeting these others is seen as something scary, a threat. And the future becomes this kind of battlefield where we are all empowered and then meet each other. That's what you can read in the idea of empowerment. And then you can begin to ask, is that the way of education? Where I, as a student, build up my strength, harness myself. You can say, why do we do that? Well, the risk is that less and less then can come in, that it becomes more and more difficult for me to be touched. I use this phrase that my soul can no longer be touched if I'm completely harnessed. And where you can say what education is doing there is that it anesthetizes students by saying, be prepared, build up your shield so that you can stand this encounter. Now you can say this is an over-interpretation of empowerment, but I think empowerment very quickly gets you in this direction. And when I look at a lot of policy documents around intercultural communication, I see this kind of gesture, this kind of direction. Here is a definition that says, what is intercultural communicative competence? That's the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately with people from other language and other cultural backgrounds. So we have these other people from other backgrounds and with other languages, and we need to become competent to be able to communicate with them. And then you see in the policy, and this is based on particular research, that it says for this students need to have empathy, respect, tolerance, sensitivity, flexibility. And at one level you can say, well, this sounds really good. We should work to make sure that our students have all this. I always worry when I read these kind of educational programs that they always sort of look after the event, after the encounter, and then say, oh, there is something that we like, and it looks like there was empathy and respect and tolerance and so on. But when you're in the middle of that, I wonder whether all of this is there. And when you are before the encounter, that would be the question, should you first have all this empathy, respect, tolerance, sensitivity, and flexibility before you can encounter? The other thing I find remarkably absent is that in many of these policies, it is assumed that all other human beings, and I'll come back to this whole notion of otherness, that they all sort of deserve our empathy and respect and tolerance and sensitivity and flexibility. But I wonder whether that is the case, whether we can simply say, all encounters with others, we meet others and they deserve our empathy and respect, or whether there is also a judgment to be made, whether that is the way to encounter others. I am not sure whether I think that Vladimir Putin would nowadays deserve any empathy and respect, for example, although he is a very other. There is a lot more. I just show this in order to give you an indication that at least in Europe, there is an awful lot of policy that tries to say, what should we give to our students to make sure that they are competent intercultural communicators. And even in the policy, they have ended up with this kind of thing where they say, yeah, we can list all the attitudes students should get, all the knowledge, all the skills, all the values, and then they are competent to step into this encounter, you could say. What I find odd with a picture like this is that in the middle it says competence, whereas I would expect that in the middle it would say a human being or a student. So many of these discussions become quite abstract and begin to forget that our students are human beings. They are not just, you can say, a collection of values, attitudes, skills, knowledge, understanding, and competence, but they are someone who meet another human being and need to come to a judgment about what needs to be done there. And I even put it a bit bluntly, where you can say, if we do not start in all this with the question, can we be bothered engaging with other people who cross our path? If we just think we need to get all these values and attitudes and everything into our students, maybe we are missing a very fundamental point. So this is the first line, and I'll do 5 lines, and how shall I put it? Well, you need to work hard to bring all the lines together, and I'll try to do that at the end as well. So I think in much of this, I would say someone is missing, and what I like in the word someone is always that we find the word one, so that refers to each of us as an individual human being. This is the preparation part. I now would like to share some thoughts about culture, because in many of these policies, people very quickly talk about intercultural communication, intercultural education, the cultural others coming from different cultural backgrounds, also in the way in which cultural diversity is seen as the problem for which intercultural education needs to, you can say, provide the answer or the solution even. When you read the literature, all kind of critical questions are raised. Do cultures coincide with nations or with language? Probably not. Are cultures static and abstract, or are they dynamic? Is culture a matter of identity? You can ask all these questions, but I want to go sort of underneath that and look a bit at the assumption that I think that you can find in many of these discussions and all the interesting questions that are being asked around culture and cultural diversity and cultural identity, because they all seem to assume that culture exists, that culture is something that we can simply find in the world and can use to then raise all kind of questions. Now, one suggestion I want to do is that I don't think that culture is something that exists. I think that we use the word culture and the notion of culture as a particular way to explain, you can say, the experience of difference. So we encounter difference, and when we then say, this is cultural difference, here is a group of people from a different culture, we are explaining that difference in a very particular way. I think somewhere in the background, the use of the idea of culture relies on the distinction between nature and culture, where people would say we are all natural beings and our differences are sort of the cultural layer on top of that. What I'm not completely like, there's my concern, is that when we say to someone else, oh, you have a different cultural background, we are not just eradicating the difference by saying it's cultural, but we're also saying, well, this difference is cultural and nothing else. You can say that worries me a little about using the notion of culture there, because you can say differences can be named in many other ways. You can even begin to say that when you say to someone else, oh, you come from a different culture, or your difference has something to do with your cultural background, that you begin to explain the difference of the other in your own framework. And there I think the whole idea of culture as an explanation of difference is in a sense a colonial gesture, because it starts from the one who says, I can name your difference in a particular way. That's the worry I have when we use the word culture too quickly and do not see what's being done with that idea. More philosophically, I think this idea that we can explain difference by putting a particular perspective on it, that in itself is a modern gesture. I really like it, a very interesting essay from Martin Heidegger, who says the idea of a cultural perspective, the very possibility of a perspective, is a modern idea. So we cannot say there is a modern worldview and a pre-modern worldview. The very idea that we can think of the world as something we can view from a perspective marks sort of modernity. So as I've just said, this raises questions about what this cultural perspective actually does. And in a minute, I want to say a few more things about the modern character and what's happening there. But you can say, as soon as we name difference as cultural difference, if we say to others, are you culturally different from us? If we say as educators, therefore we need to prepare our students for the intercultural encounter, we are in a third-person perspective. We have a total picture of what's going on here, which begins to raise the question, are we really encountering there, or have we already put a theory, an explanation in between ourselves and others? There are more ideas and lines of thought here. I think somewhere this is also a critique of particular forms of critical pedagogy that say we can empower students by helping them to see what kind of frames and perspectives they are using. And particularly, we can empower and emancipate our students if we make visible the perspectives they are using that they themselves are not aware of. There again, you can say the teacher begins to explain to students what is really happening in their head and in their thinking and in their thoughts and in their feelings. And it raises the question whether that is emancipatory or not. So this is a little thread in the knitting, which goes back to the interesting work of Jacques Rancière and his idea of teachers who need to work with a degree of ignorance, which doesn't mean that teachers should know nothing, but I see it as the point he is making, that as teachers we should refrain from explaining our students. So I've said something about preparation, and I've raised some questions about culture. And in the third step, I want to link that to the question of the other, which I am aware these are big questions with big discussions. So I'm trying to find my way through this in hopefully an original or interesting way. When we talk about intercultural encounters with others, I want to suggest that we frame these encounters in the ways in which we view others, because we say we meet others, and the difference we encounter there we explain as a cultural difference. That begins to say something about the relationship that is implied here. You can say, if we name another human being as a cultural other, we put ourselves in the position where we are an observer of the other. And I find that an interesting way to look into this, because I think many of the educational policies I showed about intercultural communication and intercultural communication, they all say we need to prepare our students so that they become more competent at sort of viewing and being respectful and empathetic towards others. So you can say what these policies do is that they try to make students better at being a spectator of another human being. The image that comes to mind is a bit like that of a bird watcher, where you can say we try to equip and prepare our students so that they become more competent, more skillful, with the right values to watch the other. Now, this idea has itself a history, and what I want to show is why, on the one hand, there is something important in this history, but also where we end up with a problem. I think what is important here is that the idea of a perspective, for example, in the visual arts, has not always been there. When you look at Egypt art, the point is not that you can say the artists were not competent enough yet to really paint in a real life way. You can say in that way of painting, the whole question of the perspective, where the painter or the one watching is standing, is simply not a consideration. And it's interesting to see, and that's what I'm trying to do here with a couple of pictures, is that at some point in visual art, suddenly the perspective of the observer becomes part of how a picture is being painted. Apparently, but I'm not a specialist, the second picture you see here is the first painting that uses perspective. And then in the middle, you see sort of that perspective becomes more and more of an issue. Then you see another famous painting by a Dutch painter who also plays a lot with perspective, and you really have the idea that you get into the real life situation. I also have a graphic there from Maurits Escher, a Dutch drawer, painter, who in his work really troubles the whole question of perspective. What is important about a perspective? You can say a perspective implies a position, a standpoint for the observer. So in the Egypt painting, there is no standpoint for the observer, whereas in the perspectivist paintings in the middle, there's a very clear standpoint for the observer. And you can say at the same time, a world that can be observed from that standpoint emerges. And that, I think, is important to get into the history of the whole question of interculturalism and the relationship with the other. That you can say when perspectivism emerges, a position for the one observing becomes possible, and a position for that what is being observed becomes possible. And I think this actually is the fundamental modern dualism. So I don't think that mind-body is the most important dualism, but you can say the observer and the observed. That's the modern dualism. This is important, and that is what I think is interesting about it, because with the birth of perspectivism, to say it, a position for the individual to be in a particular position becomes possible. And you can say there the I or the individual or the subject as a freestanding subject becomes possible. That's the interesting step forward, that something happens there that speaks to the modern consciousness of individual human beings with freedom. The problem is that position for the individual is the position where other human beings in the world become an object of their view. Here I want to turn to the work of Emmanuel Levinas, whose work has been really important in my own thinking, because I think what Levinas does really well is that he raises questions about precisely this setup of the free human being as an observer of the world outside of him or her. In Levinas, you can find this as a critique of what he calls the ego-logical worldview, where the ego comes before the world, and the world is that which the ego then observes and encounters as an object for observation. I think there is much more in what Levinas is highlighting there. So you can also say he raises critical questions about the idea that the first way in which the self is in relation with the world is in terms of knowing the world, or in terms of understanding the world. And you can say what Levinas is after is to try to move away from this idea that we as human beings are observers of the world around us. And I'm saying this because I think this is the frame out of which the whole idea of intercultural communication and intercultural education emerges. Levinas turns this around with an idea that sometimes is referred to as ethics is first philosophy, or ethics as first philosophy. Now, I do think that people who write about Levinas sometimes interpret this as saying that Levinas is telling us that we should be responsible, that our duty is to be responsible, for example, for the other. I don't think that that is what Levinas is trying to do. I think that the point he is rather trying to make is one that I find brilliantly formulated by Zygmunt Bauman, who says what Levinas is after is that he says responsibility is the first reality of the self. And that means that the first reality of the self, you can say myself becomes an issue for me when I encounter a responsibility. So that moment of encountering a responsibility, a question, a demand, an imperative, that is a moment where suddenly I realize that I am here and that there is maybe something for me to do. So you can say when we encounter responsibility, we encounter ourselves as individuals. My responsibility is not your responsibility. And therefore we encounter our freedom, because we always have the possibility in any question that comes to us to engage with the question or to walk away from it. So here you can begin to see how the first person comes in a different way, not as the one who observes the world outside of him or herself, but as the one who meets their own freedom through a responsibility that comes to me. So this, you can say, is where my existence as an individual doesn't start from me, but it comes to me. And I would say this is a kind of phenomenology of the I or the self, not an explanation or an ontology. So what Levinas, I think, helps us to do is to show that to think about the I and where the self appears in the world is not necessarily in this modern idea where the I is an observer of the world. And I find that, again, important for intercultural communication, because in intercultural communication, intercultural education, the idea is that it starts with me observing an other as a culturally different other. So that was the third thread in my knitting work, and I have 2 threads left, and I hope you still have some energy. So here's number 4, and that's the question of time. In intercultural education and intercultural communication, we are talking about encounters, and I've raised some fundamental questions about what that encounter is. Now, you could say that encounter is a matter of space, where I am here, you are there, and we meet each other. From me to you, from you to me. but that encounter is not a matter of time. And here I want to share some interesting ideas from a German scholar, Johannes Fabian, and the book has been translated into English. And Fabian is an anthropologist, and you could say he's a philosopher of anthropology, just as we are philosophers of education. And in the book, maybe if you can sort of follow what I'm trying to do, there is something interesting, because he asks the question how anthropology makes its object of study, and it has something to do with time and the other. And Fabian makes 2 points. He says communication between human beings assumes that we are in the same time. And I find that a very interesting and important idea, that when we communicate, we assume that we are in the same time. He uses a German word for that. So if you know German, I think that the German word is really precise, Gleichzeitigkeit. You can say being in the same time. In English, it becomes coevalness, which loses a bit of the reference to time. But then Fabian asks, what have anthropologists been doing in their study of other cultures? And therefore it's relevant for this exploration of intercultural education. Fabian's claim is that he says that in anthropology, when anthropologists study other cultures, they always place those cultures in a different time. So he says anthropology actually denies that the anthropologist and the culture they are studying are in the same time. And he has a nice word for that as well, alachronism, where he says that is the tendency to place those that are studied by anthropologists in a different time, to say they have not yet developed as much as we have, for example. Now, what I find interesting here is that when we go back and see what the word culture does, and if for the moment you go with my suggestion that when we use the word culture, we explain difference in a very particular way, then it could well be that in that way of explaining, by saying, oh, you have a different culture, or you come from a different culture, and that's why you're different, then maybe what we are doing there is to create a distance and putting the other human being in a different time by saying you're somewhere else on the scale of cultural development. And I think as long as we think of the other as an object that we need to interpret or understand or empathize with or get into their perspective, there is always the danger that we put the other in a different time. Now, if you can still follow that, but as I said, these are also my own attempts at thinking anew about this, then you could say, rather than to talk about this intercultural encounter in terms of how can we become better and more competent at sort of observing the other, understanding the other, doing that with more empathy, maybe there is a very different challenge, the challenge how we can become what I call here contemporaries, the challenge in the encounter to end up in the same time. And there is a lovely little book written by a Belgian author, but then translated into German, that actually explores this whole question of what would it mean if we try to become, in German, Zeitgenossen, contemporaries, to you can say, travel in the same time. I find that theoretically an interesting idea. That you can say is the beauty of doing educational theory and philosophy, that we take the the time to explore and get excited about these possibilities. But I think this whole question, the whole challenge of becoming contemporaries, trying to be together in the same time, is also an urgent political question. When I look at some of the big problems we are facing in the world, they are not just questions about identity or political ideology or belief, but they also always position others in another time, ahead or behind, backwards. So those are 4 of my threads, and I'll go to the 5th and final thread of the knitting work. So I've raised questions about preparation. I have raised questions about culture, about the other, and about time. And I want to conclude with some observations about pedagogy. One way in which you could try to understand what I'm doing is that I have raised critical questions about what I call third-person perspectives, where I say, be mindful, culture is an explanation from the outside, from a very particular position. It is a totalizing explanation of difference. And what I have done is, with Levinas, for example, to say, actually, the question of the encounter with other human beings is not a theoretical matter, is not a matter of observation and understanding, but it's a challenge for each of us to meet someone. You can say that's a turn towards a first-person perspective. Not the question, how can I understand this cultural other, but what is there for me to do in this encounter? How does it speak to me? And what I've put there quickly is this challenge to say, maybe the challenge in all that is, can we end up in the same time, and what would that mean? So I've spoken about the problems with third-person perspective. I've highlighted the importance of the first-person perspective, the first reality of the self. But you can say, well, you haven't said anything yet about education. And I think that's correct. So my 5th thread, in a sense, tries to get the education into the picture. That you can say a question of pedagogy, or the question of the teacher and teaching. And I've already said pedagogy is a bit an ambiguous term in English and German. Now, the author I want to bring into this exploration is a German scholar, Klaus Prang. I'm very excited about his work, because when he goes to education and asks what is distinctive about education, why is the form of living of education very different from the economic sphere or the family sphere or the leisure sphere? Prang says we often answer that question by talking about all the things we want from education, like that intercultural education should prepare our students for the encounter with cultural others. We can say that, but you can say quite quickly that is wishful thinking, and we forget what education itself is. And what I really like about Prang is that he says, forget for a moment about all the agendas and all the things we want from education, or all the things we would say as policymakers that education should do, and start by exploring what actually is special about education as a practice. And that's Pranger's insight, I think, where he says, let's start with the form of education, the form of pedagogy, because in the form of education, also, I think, as it's happening right now in this talk, we can find something about what makes education distinctive, and that can help us to go back and say, so what then can we do as educators and what not? Pranger's claim, and again, if you know German, you can already see it in the title of the book, is that he says the most fundamental and most distinctive form of education is what in German is called zeigen. And zeigen means both pointing, but also showing. And you can say when we point, we always try to show our students something. Prange is very clear. He says when there is no zeigen going on, when there is no pointing and no showing, then you can be sure it's not education. So education always needs to have this dimension of pointing and showing. And it's of course funny that we have this technology called PowerPoint, where you can say in a very powerful way, we try to point our students or our audience in a particular direction. Prange also highlights that pointing is something very special, because when we point and say to a student, have a look there, pay attention to this, we do two things at the same time. We point away from the student and say, look there, but in a sense, we also point to the student and say, you look there. So there is something double there in pointing. And then you can say, where does the teacher stand there? Well, the teacher is always trying to catch the attention of the student, to point their attention to something. Prange calls it a theme, you can call it the world or the curriculum or an object. The very thing that teachers should never do is to point to themselves and say to students, look at me, become like me. That you can say is uneducational. So as teachers, we always stand in this triadic relationship where we try to point our students in the direction of something else. I enjoy Prange, so I get excited about some of the details. One claim he makes is that he says we tend to think that teaching is sort of intellectual work, but he says it's first of all manual labor. You need a hand in order to teach. The pointing works with a finger. You can say what we do there in teaching is to try to focus the attention of our students. You can say we demand attention from our students in a good sense. But Prange also knows, and I think all teachers know this, we can never enforce or control the attention of our students. So it always remains an open gesture, an invitation. That means that when you then ask what should students do when their attention is directed in a particular direction, well, that's up to them. That's precisely where, as teachers, we cannot go further. Of course, we can have expectations and hopes for our students, but ultimately we cannot enforce what they will do with what comes into their attention. And therefore, and I find that quite beautiful in Prange's work, you can say, in the pointing, you can find a concern for the freedom of the students, the inability to control. And that is not to tell to our students, just do what you want to do. That you can say is the problem with neoliberal notions of freedom. Let's say to be free means to do what you want to do without any responsibility. You can say it's another kind of freedom, the freedom to meet this world outside of yourself and to figure out what you need to do there in relation to what you encounter. And this again is a phrase from Emmanuel Levinas, who says, what's the real freedom? That's to do what only I can do and no one else can do in my place. And I think there is an important message for education there. I'm nearly finished. So this, for me, suggests that the whole question of pedagogy, you can say the education dimension of intercultural education, is ultimately not about learning, not learning about the other. I see that a lot in intercultural communication, that we should learn about these others so that we better understand them. What I also don't like is the idea that students should learn from the other. And I don't like that idea because it very quickly turns the other into an instrument for my learning. And again, in both cases, I think there is no real encounter. You can say, where does an encounter begin? When something comes to me, when someone else speaks to me, says hello, or how are you, or where are you? And for me, that is a gesture of teaching, not of learning. You can say when that happens in your life, this question, what is this asking of me? What is this encounter asking of me? This interruptive question, that is what happens if you take the encounter seriously. That's a question that interrupts. You can say it's also a question that awakes. So very early on in the talk, I raised some questions about empowerment, that it runs the risk of anesthetizing our students. To awake our students is precisely the domain of aesthetics, where you encounter a question and then you can say it puts you in question. And when we begin to think of the encounter, and I will no longer call that the intercultural encounter in that way, as something that comes to you, that interrupts where you are, you can say that's a moment of disarmament when that comes in. And maybe in that we find this interesting, but maybe also strange call to step into the same time. So those were the 5 threads: preparation, culture, the other, time, and pedagogy. And I'll just summarize what I think I've done, but then you need to make up your mind about what you think that I've done and maybe what you've been doing in between. So the problem I've highlighted with pedagogies of empowerment is that they focus a lot on all the equipment that students should get, but that the whole question of who is there and what kind of equipment is needed is very absent there. Whereas I think that one of the first questions is not what is all the equipment that we should get into our students, but how can we make sure that our students are awake, that they may encounter something, that they can be bothered to be open, and that they also can encounter this question whether this other that crosses my path is deserving of my understanding or not. I've raised some questions about the whole idea of culture, where I think if we simply think the other is a cultural other, then we put the other at a distance and in a cultural frame, and we become observer and observed. And there I've tried to suggest we shouldn't think of these relationships in terms of observation, understanding, but in terms, you can say, of being spoken to, meeting an appeal or a question. That, as I've tried to say, but I know that if you're not into this literature, this may have come too quickly. This is not the demand to be ethical, to say you should be ethical for the other, but it's a moment where you encounter your freedom. And that's one thing I was trying to do, to say, let's not think of this whole field of intercultural education as we need to make our students more responsible and more ethical. I'm inclined to say the work there is to actually take the encounter more seriously itself, because the encounter is something that comes to me. That has something to do with the aesthetics of education, with the possibility that somewhere you are touched. And as I said, I like this phrase of that your soul is being touched. Now, as teachers, you can say that our task is not to touch the soul of the students. When we do that, we very quickly end up in a problematic authoritarian or moralizing or normative position. But what I like about Prange and his idea of pointing is to say the best we can do as teachers is to constantly bring things outside of a student's world into their attention, so that maybe at some point some of what they encounter there may touch them. That's where we are as teachers. You can say when that touching is possible, then maybe that's the moment where the eye of the student is sort of called into existence. And that, I think, requires an opening, a laying down of arms, rather than that we say we need to empower our students for that encounter. And that's what I had in mind by saying, let's talk about this a little less in terms of empowerment and a bit more in terms of disarmament, because that, I think, is what the experience of difference and the encounter really is about. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I hope it wasn't too much, but it was a lot, and it's still fresh thinking for me. So I hope we have an opportunity to turn this inside out, which you sometimes also do when you knit a sweater. You turn it inside out and suddenly it looks pretty good or pretty awful.
Thank you very much, Professor Biesta. It was actually a very provocative speech in some points. I think it gets me thinking in a lot of questions. And right now we are receiving, or actually we're open to receive questions through the chat, the meeting room. And I think Professor Ralph wants to speak. Yeah, please.
Well, thank you very much, Gert. That was very, very interesting. But I have one problem. I liked very much how you criticized the idea of what I call a disengaged subject, and the idea of that subject as an observer of the observed, and all the neoliberalism and the idea of freedom that comes with that, etc., etc., etc. But what worries me a little bit is the normative dimension, not normative in terms of ethics, but normative in terms of, I can't imagine a world. I think we are in a certain way structured by norms, because in our interaction with the world, we only are capable of interacting in the world to the extent that we develop strategies and ways of acting, even ways of speaking. So this gets to language as well, which enables me to interact with the world, which means interacting with others as well, obviously, in a way that I can survive as an individual. And I wonder to what extent we have the sort of freedom you're wanting at the end of your talk, which seems to me to be a freedom from norms completely. And I find that really difficult to understand. So, for example, if you take the Escher engraving, I wouldn't know how to get around in that world. I wouldn't know how to do it. And I wouldn't know how to point to it, which is a question of joint attention with a student, to help a student get around that world, because it has norms that I don't recognize, I can't work with, I can't get involved in. Now, this doesn't say that norms are set in stone, nothing like that. And of course, norms can be exaggerated, they can be distorted and become oppressive, obviously. Yeah, we all know that, whether they're ethical norms or whether they're other norms, ideologies or whatever. But I think there's a normative dimension that has to come in at some point. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I appreciate that you refer to the Escher drawing, because for me, Escher is not showing sort of an ideal that we should strive towards. I think Escher is showing the problem if we take perspectivism to its extreme. And when I look at what's happening in the United States, I think that that's where you see people taking perspectivism to their extreme by just saying, I have my truth and you may have your truth, but there's nothing beyond that. So you can say that's the dystopia that Escher actually tries to show, and that it's impossible to have an orientation in that. So in that sense, to what I think, what you call the normative dimension is important. You have to be somewhere. If you're all over the place, then you can say there is no, you use the word survival, and I understand that in that way. The question is, what is needed to be somewhere? And I would say it's important that we help our students to be somewhere. And then I'm trying to suggest that is far less a matter of your perspective or your opinions, but you are somewhere, and here I used Levinas, when you encounter something that asks you a question. And I find that sort of the interesting thing I'm exploring, and that is normative in the sense that you can say it matters. There is something really serious when just another human being asks you something, can you help? Or can you be there when I need you? It can be quite big, but it's also in the little gestures. And that you can say, puts you in a place, but it's not the place of your freedom, of your perspective. And that's in a sense what I'm trying to explore here, to say there is a possibility to go beyond the neoliberal freedom of just doing what you want to do. That doesn't end up in this dystopia that you see in Escher, and I think that you see with post-truth and sort of it's sort of political relativism, by saying there is a different position where we can be if we take the questions that come to us seriously. And there I think as educators, rather than to tell our students, oh, you should become a critical thinking and need to be able to make up your own mind and develop your own opinions, which for me is all empowerment. I think the disarmament is to say, let's work on seeing what kind of questions constantly appeal to us and ask for us. So that's where I would, go with your really interesting and profound observation, I think.
Thank you very much, Gert. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you, Professor Biesta. Thank you, Professor Rolf. Temos mais perguntas. Temos comentário vindo do YouTube. We have a comment from a YouTube viewer, Alex Sander. He says, great thinking, great reflections from Professor Biesta. More than ever, the question of the other is in the order of the day in times of intolerance or maybe prejudice and violence of all kinds. Would you like to comment, Professor?
So it's I think the question of the other is there, and when you talk about intolerance and violence, I think for me these are all manifestations from, at least, what I'm trying to explore. If we start from ourselves and then say, oh, there is this other and we need to get to this other, we can do that with respect and empathy. But I think in the same gesture, we can also find intolerance and violence. And I'm not saying that violence and respect are the same thing, but what I'm probably trying to say is there is a different gesture, a different direction that is not about what do I want, in relation to the other, but what actually is the question that I encounter there that is there for me. So that's one quick way in which I can respond to this, that I think the problem that I've tried to highlight is that, particularly in intercultural education, the other is seen as something sort of outside of me that I in some way need to get into a relation to. And partly I'm suggesting, well, don't think that we exist first and then we see if there are any others in the world. Our very existence is the response to others who are already there. But that also, puts my whole sense of self in a different position. So I think the whole question of the other is what I'm trying to get at. And for me, intercultural education too much starts from the self that needs to be empowered, then to go out to the other. And actually, I found that a strange idea.
Thank you. Temos mais questões? Sim, uma questão encaminhada pela professora Christiane Gottschalk. A question from our colleague, Professor Christiane Gottschalk. It's a great pleasure to hear you. If possible, I would like you to precise what are you calling the first reality of the self and its relation with the freedom of the student to do what he wants.
Yeah, let me try, but do come back if. So there is this sentence from Zygmunt Bauman who says, responsibility is the first reality of the self. And Bauman gives that as a way to understand what the work of Levinas is about. And as I try to say, there are people who say, when I read Levinas, he tells us that we should be responsible. And I don't think that is what Levinas is telling us. Levinas is trying to figure out, when does the question of myself becomes a question? When does it become an issue for me? And then he says it's when we encounter a responsibility or a question or a request. Those are the moments in which we suddenly can realize, do not always realize, that there is something for me to do. And there you can say the whole question of the self becomes a question for me. So there are people who can live a happy life, but never really meet themselves or their freedom, because they never are really aware that there are questions posed to them or calls to them. So that's the idea of the first reality of the self, which is a way to think about the self not as the starting point. So not to say the self is first of all there and the self observes the world or tries to understand the world and then tries to understand others and tries to act. That moment of the self is, you can say, produced, if you want to use a strong word, by the question that comes to you. Now again, that question doesn't tell you what to do. So if I ask you, can you help me with this? It's not just that you suddenly realize, oh, that's a question for me, not just for anyone, but you also encounter your freedom there, because on that question you can say, yes, I can help you, or you can say, no, I have no time, or I don't want to do that. And there you find your freedom. So that's important as well. In this first reality of the self, you find your freedom. And yeah, I think that is important. So any requests, any questions, any appeals, any calls are never sort of what is it, telling you what you should do. So you need to make up your own mind, but then not in the neoliberal sense where you just say, oh, I just do what I want to do. You actually encounter your freedom only when there is this question for you, and then there is something at stake in your freedom. Because if you say no to someone who asks you for help, yeah, that's quite something to say no. And to live with that burden is also what you find in the freedom. And for me, all that helps to say, yes, freedom matters, but not in the neoliberal sense. And the I matters and comes into play in responsibility, but not in an ethical sense. That's how I would respond to the comments.
Thank you again, Professor. We have another question that comes from YouTube. Daniel Santos. He says, dear teacher Biesta, when you mentioned about preparation matter really got me in a deep way. As a teacher, we must be prepared. Do you still have any other extra priceless tips about that, please?
So yeah, most of my discussion was about, should we think of what we do as teachers as preparing our students? But what I hear in this question is also, what does it mean as a teacher to be prepared? If I understand the point correctly, but do come back. There is something about being prepared. So on the one hand, you can say, yes, as teachers, we should be prepared. But at the same time, we should also be prepared for what we cannot prepare ourselves for. Derrida has this very nice phrase, what he says, preparing for the incalculable. So the things we cannot predict that will happen. And you can say as a teacher, if we think, and that's what I really hate about all this evidence-based teaching that says, the evidence can already tell us what we will encounter as teachers, and we just need to be prepared by knowing all the evidence, and then we do the right interventions. Then in a sense, you deny that there are students in your classroom who may surprise you. So to be prepared as a teacher is also to be prepared precisely for what you cannot foresee. And that's what I like about playing with the idea of preparedness on the side of the teacher. Long ago, I studied theology, so sometimes little phrases from the Bible come to mind. And one is this image of the thief in the night. What it means to be prepared for the thief in the night, where you cannot see the thief coming and do not know that the thief is coming. And to live with the possibility that will happen in your life. I think that begins to speak to how as teachers we should try to be with our students.
The next question, actually, it's related, I think, to the first one, to this last one. And it comes from Tania Cristina Afonso. She says, hello, teacher Biesta. I am studying pedagogy at University of São Paulo, and I teach, I think it's 101 ICT classes, 1 laptop per student. Please enlighten me, how we'll be able to apply this non-normative pedagogy on new classrooms?
I love the phrasing of the question. I'm honored to be called teacher, and of course that call is also a call and a burden, but also the request to enlighten has a long educational history, and there is always something difficult here. That in education, particularly when you do theoretical and philosophical work, then people say, yeah, I like the ideas, but can you tell us, how do you do this in practice? what should we do? What are the practical implications? And I often say, well, it would be silly if I'm going to tell you what you should do. And so that's always also my first response when people ask, what should we do? I think, well, that's the beautiful work of being a teacher, that we, in each new situation, we need to create a pedagogical situation and need to make something possible there. And what theory can do is to allow you to look at that situation sort of in different ways. Herbart, a German scholar, long ago said, all this talk about whether theory can be applied to practice or not is the wrong question. He uses the notion of topology, where he says, theory gives you a map, and you can make 20 different maps of the same area, and they allow you to navigate that in different ways. So partly I would say I would be curious to have a conversation over coffee about what does this mean in a classroom? What does this allow you to see and not to see? So if you work in ICT classes, I'm just improvising here a little, but I can imagine that very quickly you get into, we are equipping our students, we give them the knowledge and skills to work with this, and that is the work we do as a teacher. But you can also turn that in the opposite direction and say, what does it mean to encounter this technology? Not just how you, a student, can master this, but where does this put you as a student when you work with a computer or a laptop or in the world of ICT? So one thing where I think this is very productive, and I've seen that in my own teaching, this question, what is this asking of me, is for me the question I constantly go back to, where I try to put things in front of my students, to say it in a simplistic way, in the hope that that question, what that is asking of them, begins to emerge. When you work there, rather than to say to your students, this is what you should learn, or you should tell me what you've learned, for me that's very unhelpful, actually, in most cases. So that's where I would start with saying, where can you make this into good practice? By in a sense, turning it around and seeing where are we, when we want to help our students, contributing to empowering them to the point where nothing can come in, and what does it mean to work with disarmament, to go in the opposite direction.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question. Tanya, she thanks you a lot for the comments. And Professor Leone asks, what are the implications of your suggestions on intercultural education for contemporary democracy? Do you believe that globalization has facilitated or prevented intercultural relations to happen?
So if I respond to the first part first, I would probably say a lot of intercultural education is a mistake. And it's a mistake because it's, well, in what I tried to say, it puts a whole frame over the world to say there is cultural difference, and it does something very specific by saying you as students need to become equipped or empowered or become armed to step into this difficult battle of meeting cultural others. So I really worry that all the good intentions in intercultural education actually produce more difference and distance than what it said that it wants to do. And therefore I'm saying, can we go back to the whole question of the encounter and put that much more at the center, rather than to have all these long lists with competencies and things students should acquire. Globalization, globalization has many dimensions. There is economic globalization, there is technological globalization, there is the globalization of environmental problems. So I always think it's helpful when we talk about globalization to name all these different dimensions. And then you can say what is valuable about globalization is that it has highlighted our interdependence. But you currently see with the situation in the Ukraine that triggers a sort of a deglobalization, that nation states are saying, oh, we need to make sure that our own energy is under our control. And that, is a worrying development, but an understandable one. So I think there is a whole discussion to be had about what has globalization done in terms of relations and encounters. And when we keep calling those sort of intercultural or cultural difference, that for me is a worrying way to think about globalization. I very quickly mentioned the whole question of colonialism, and I tend to think that the cultural and intercultural framework is in a sense a colonial gesture, where from the center all other difference is already named in the terms of the center. But I'm making big statements here, so I'm losing the nuance a little. I'm aware of that.
Thank you very much, Professor. Temos mais questões? Do we have more questions?
Tem mais uma no chat, Bruno, do Jacir Silvio Sanson Júnior, pouco antes da professora Cristiane.
Sim. Obrigado, Professor Samuel. Another question, Professor Biesta. From Jacir Silvio Sanson Jr., how to address or approach pedagogical relation in which the teacher points to himself and not for the theme any longer. Would this be a problem of moral vanity? Would be an psychoanalytical question? How to take it to the field of public policies and multicultural education? That's an easy one, right?
Can I just say yes? Yeah. So the part of what I tried to do is to say the educational relation is not the relationship between teacher and student. There is always a third element, which Pranger calls the theme. You can call it the thing. I'd like to call it the world. And the work of the teacher is always to point in some way the student to the world, away from themselves. And I think that's a really important insight, because if you think that educational relationships are dyadic and it's the teacher and the student, then of course there are only two options for the teacher. Either the teacher says, pay attention to me, but then the teacher becomes an authority figure. And a lot of people have seen that problem, and then they say, oh, the teacher should disappear and should become a learner amongst other learners in a learning community. But that also doesn't solve the problem, because I think it destroys education in itself. So I think that's the importance of this triadic way of thinking, because it's both a critique of sort of the authoritarian position of the teacher, but it's also a critique of what in my work I've called the learnification of education, where the teacher actually disappears. So the teacher has something to do, but the teacher should never become the object of attention. Then it's no longer educational, and you could say maybe even something psychoanalytic comes into play there. So teachers who want to be in the center of attention, they probably should look for a different job. They should, start a YouTube channel and become an influencer, but not a teacher.
Thank you, Professor. Temos mais questões a serem encaminhadas? Algum dos professores aqui presentes gostaria de colocar alguma questão? Samuel, por favor.
Sim. Eu vou primeiro formular em português e já comento, né? Que o professor ele criticou a estratégia de empoderamento, a pedagogia de empoderamento, e realmente Levinas parece ser um bom fundamento para essa afirmação. Eu fico me perguntando se seria possível mesmo superar a estratégia de empoderamento quando na formação de professores, dos nossos programas no geral, dos cursos, está se ensinando justamente como se empoderar, né? And Professor Biesta, thank you very much for your speech. It's very clear. I like very much to hear from you, reading your books. And you criticize the strategy of empowerment, and Levinas is a good foundation for this assertion, of course. But my question is really possible to overcome this strategy when the teacher training in general, in Brazil at least, are teaching exactly how to be empowerment, how to do it? I'm thinking about that. Looks like some influence we have from the 18th century, 19th century, and something is so deep in our culture, in our schools. And I was thinking about that. I'd like to hear from. Thank you.
So I think it's everywhere. It's a very, you can say, seductive way to think about education and teacher education. I would also say that's why philosophy of education and theory of education is so important. First of all, to open up sort of other ways of thinking, to bring in other notions, to show distinctions. So for me, the first question is never, can this be done? But for me, the first question is always, can we think differently here? Because if we cannot think differently, then we are stuck. Because then we probably also cannot act differently if we cannot imagine other ways of thinking. And I think that's also the practical importance of the work we do. I often refer to Margaret Thatcher, who had this phrase, "There is no alternative." And I think that's really dangerous if we say there is no alternative. So our work is partly to produce alternative ways of thinking in order then to see what happens to our doing. And then if you have this distinction between empowerment and disarmament, for me, that's very valuable as a teacher, that I can look again at my practice and say, so what am I doing? But also what should I be doing? Should I just think of, I need to prepare my students as best as possible? And you can say, if you take that to extreme, you either have to prepare them for all possibilities that they may ever encounter in their whole career, and that's not possible. Then of course you can say, yes, as teachers we have routines and we develop our routines, but you can also say that the best preparation is also to prepare for the incalculable, to use Derrida again. And I think there the idea of disarmament is actually really important, for example, in teacher education. I know a beautiful example of a course with student teachers, where for a week they worked with a clown, and the whole point of that week was to help the students to stand in front of a group without any preparation. You can say that's the art of the clown. A really good clown can improvise on the spot. And you can say that's a strategy of disarmament, where you say, well, wait a minute, what does it mean actually as a teacher to be 100% attentive to what is in front of you? And for me, then it becomes very practical. And it doesn't mean that empowerment is only bad and disarmament is only good, but that you see that you need both as a good teacher. And if you only push in the direction of empowerment, you actually begin to disempower your teachers, because they can only deal with the predictable, but never the unpredictable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Biesta. Mais questões? Do you have any other questions? Then I'll make a question, just a short one, and I'll make it first in Portuguese. Então, vou perguntar ao professor Biesta um ponto que me chamou bastante a atenção logo no início, quando ele diz que a cultura, de certo modo, não existe. A cultura é um conceito que marca diferenças. E, diante disso, é preciso, estou sendo bastante breve aqui, né, uma pedagogia que seja uma pedagogia do encontro, e nem tanto uma pedagogia da ética, no sentido de que a ética seria aquilo que reforça os elementos de identidade em uma cultura. Então, alguma coisa nesse sentido que eu vou perguntar para ele, porque me parece que essa pedagogia do encontro, por assim dizer, se coloca também como uma cultura sobre as outras. So, Professor Biesta, first of all, I'm sorry if my question comes from a misunderstanding of what you have said. But the first topic that strikes me the most is the idea that culture, it's something or a concept to highlight differences and not identities. I mean, amongst different groups, right? So, seems to me that you're proposing maybe a pedagogy of the encounters, and the encounter must be fostered more than ethics, if we understand ethics as the elements that reinforce one's identity, one's own culture, right? Wouldn't that be a kind of culture to prevail over particular identities or the identities of particular groups? I mean, are we not trapped into a third-person perspective? So I'm telling you now, pedagogy must be a pedagogy of the encounter. Wouldn't be a whole new, different culture prevailing over all different cultures?
That's a really nice question. I'll begin with giving a short answer, and then see if there is some more to go back to. Because this is why I like Prana. Because he says, of course, we can say pedagogy should be this or pedagogy should be that. But then he says, let's begin by looking at how we do pedagogy. And his suggestion, and I find it quite compelling, is that he says, when we do pedagogy, we're always putting something on the table for our students. And we sometimes with words, sometimes without words, sometimes very precise, sometimes very vague. We are constantly in this gesture of saying, Have you ever looked there? Have you ever spent time with this? You're running in that direction. Have you thought of running a bit in that direction? And I think in that form, you can say what we try as educators is to stage an encounter where we try to bring something in the attention of our students. And we do not know what's going to happen there, but that's what's in the very basic form of what we do as educators. And that would be my main response to your point, that I'm not saying this is another program, another shoot for this is what education should do. But when you go back to the classroom and begin to look at what are we actually doing there, I think that in what we're doing there, you will find that moment where what we constantly try to do in a sense is, put something in the trajectory of our students so that an encounter may happen. And of course, a lot of things can happen because you can put something in the trajectory of your students and they can just get hold of it or literally sort of eat it up and make it into their own. And sometimes that's important, but if students become too much sort of eaters of the curriculum, if you allow me to go with this image, then you put stuff in front of them that is indigestible. Because then you know as a teacher, okay, I need to do something else so that something can be encountered, rather than that students just say, yeah, okay, here it is. Like Piaget, I'll just bring it into my system and it doesn't touch me at all. So there is, of course, work to do when you say we try to put something there in the student's trajectory. But I would say this is not sort of another culture for education. I think it's in, I resist to use the word culture. I would say it is in the practical form of education that we can find this. And you can say, should we do that? Should we bother about that? And that's, of course, the important second question in your question. Why should we educate? Why do we think that it's important and justifiable to put something in the trajectory of another human being? And there I would say, when we do that, you can say we remind that other human being of their freedom and of their existence as a self. And I think that's important in a world that is not really interested in that. In an economy that says, just buy more, desire more, never ask difficult questions. In a political culture where populist politicians say, vote for me and I'll give you everything you desire, which is of course impossible. So I think in that world, there, and also in the history that has led us there is still a justification for saying this work we do as educators to put something in front of another human being and say, try to pay some attention to it. That I think that's very important work to do. And there it becomes normative, not in the sense of I have a normative program and I'm going to send it out over the whole world. But this is responding to, I think, also the challenges of our times and the points in history where things have gone wrong because whole societies forgot about this, what we can do with our freedom and where we shouldn't forget ourselves.
Thank you very much for your remarks. We have a comment from Tanya. She says, I guess that's a good reason why studying sociology and philosophy is demanded for pedagogues. We haven't got a crystal ball to visualize the future yet.
Yeah. I think precisely that discussion about empowerment and disarmament, and that it's important for pedagogues to understand that their work we cannot prepare fully for everything that we may encounter, and therefore we also need to keep an openness there. And if sociology and philosophy can help, then that's fine. But of course, there is also philosophy and sociology that becomes part of the problem. If you study philosophy only to do a test on your knowledge of philosophy.
That's true. That's true. Thank you. Temos mais questões? Do we have any other questions? Marcus, something from YouTube? No? Just for the sake of closing our session here, one last simple question, Professor. Is it possible to be a professor or a teacher and being pessimistic about the world? Or we should be always optimistic in order to educate or try to educate?
I think we should be hopeful. And yeah, that's where I keep being inspired by some phrases also of Hannah Arendt, who says the biggest wonder is the birth of new human beings and their arrival in the world. And there we can take hope from, that the world renews itself. And I think we stand close to that miracle as educators, and that's quite a special position to stand. But if from time to time we look in that direction, I think we can remain hopeful, because the world from time to time just looks like one big mess, and that can be difficult if that's the only thing we see. But that there are still children who want to be born, you could say, and still grown-ups who want to become parents, I think that gives me hope.
Thank you very much, Professor. Inspiring words. Então, como não temos mais questões a serem encaminhadas, Professor Marcus makes a comment. Being hopeful, after all, it's a way of combining pessimism and optimism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Professor Biesta. Obrigado a todos que nos acompanharam aqui pelo Google Meet, pelos canais do Paideuma, Grupo de Estudos Clássicos da FEUSP no YouTube, e também o canal da Sophie pelo YouTube. Encerramos, então, essa primeira sessão do 4º Congresso da Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia da Educação. Agradeço a todos mais uma vez e nos vemos na sessão das 7h30, não é? Quando teremos, deixa eu confirmar aqui, desculpa, quando teremos a fala da professora Patrícia Del Nero Velasco, da Universidade Federal do ABC, que vai falar sobre filosofia do ensino de filosofia. So thank you very much, Professor Biesta. Hope to see you again soon.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope you have a lovely continuation of your conference. And I hope to meet many of you in person in the future. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.